Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time we're tackling a figure who needs little introduction, especially to our listeners, I'm sure. We're diving deep into the world of Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, he's definitely a titan in the world of evolutionary biology and also a lightning rod for controversy.
Definitely. So we're going to be exploring excerpts from two of his most influential works, The God Delusion and The Selfish Gene. And trust me, these books will really make you think, maybe even challenge some of those deeply held beliefs.
You know, what I find most fascinating about Dawkins is his unwavering commitment to scientific skepticism, even when it comes to topics as deeply personal and culturally ingrained as religion.
Right, like he doesn't beat around the bush. He comes right out and says in The God Delusion that he's going to examine the idea of God with the same rigor and skepticism that scientists apply to any other hypothesis.
And that's really the crux of his argument, isn't it? He's essentially saying, let's treat the God hypothesis like any other scientific claim and see if it holds up under scrutiny.
Exactly. And he doesn't pull any punches. He even compares belief in God to belief in fairies or, well, any other supernatural being for that matter.
And I think it's important to clarify here that Dawkins is primarily addressing the notion of a supernatural interventionist God. You know, the kind of God who performs miracles, answers prayers, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. He's not necessarily challenging the beliefs of those who might see God as a more abstract force or as synonymous with nature itself, like in pantheism.
Right. For Dawkins, it's about applying a consistent standard of evidence. And when it comes to a God who actively intervenes in the world, he argues the evidence simply isn't there.
It's kind of like he's saying, show me the evidence. And, he's not afraid to inject a bit of humor into his arguments either. I mean, I chuckled when he called pantheism sexed up atheism.
He definitely has a way with words, but beneath the sharp wit, there's a really important point about the burden of proof. And this is where he brings up the brilliant analogy of Russell's teapot.
Oh, right. The teapot in space. That's a good one.
So imagine someone claiming that there's a tiny teapot orbiting the sun, too small for our telescopes to detect. And they say, well, you can't prove it's not there, so you have to accept that it exists.
Okay, that sounds a little ridiculous when you put it like that.
Exactly. And that's Dawkins' point. He's illustrating that the burden of proof lies with the person making the claim, not with the skeptic.
So it's not my job to prove that the teapot doesn't exist. It's the person claiming it does exist who needs to provide the evidence.
Precisely. And Dawkins argues that this same logic applies to claims about God's existence. If someone asserts that God exists, it's on them to provide convincing evidence, not on others to disprove it.
And this line of reasoning, it actually extends beyond just religion. It applies to all sorts of claims, right?
Absolutely. Think about the flying spaghetti monster, for example. It's a thought experiment that uses humor to highlight the absurdity of accepting claims without evidence just because they can't be disproven.
It makes you realize how important it is to be critical of what we accept as true. But Dawkins, he doesn't just take on belief in God, he also challenges agnosticism, that whole we can't know for sure stance.
Right. He's particularly critical of what he calls permanent agnosticism in principle, the idea that the existence of God is inherently unknowable.
He uses the example of the color red, I think. Like, if someone experiences the color red differently than you do, there's no way to prove or disprove their experience. You're both kind of stuck.
Exactly. And while he acknowledges that there are some things we simply can't know for sure, he argues that the existence of God isn't necessarily one of them.
So it's not that we can't, in principle, find evidence for or against God's existence. It's that we just haven't found conclusive evidence yet.
Precisely. And for Dawkins, in the absence of compelling evidence, he sees agnosticism as a way of avoiding a difficult question.
And that leads us perfectly into what is probably one of Dawkins' most powerful and well-known arguments, and it's this idea of evolution by natural selection. He really presents it as this elegant, almost like, I don't know, like an architect of life, right? It's this driving force behind all the incredible diversity, the complexity that we see in the natural world. And for Dawkins, this process, this elegant process, it directly challenges the need for a divine designer.
It really is a paradigm shift. Instead of looking to some supernatural creator as the explanation for the wonders of nature, Dawkins wants us to appreciate the power of this blind, unguided process that has, over eons, over millions and millions of years, shaped life as we know it.
And he gives some very compelling examples in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. I mean, he really digs deep into specific cases that show how these small incremental changes over time can lead to these really remarkable adaptations. One that really stuck with me was the Archaeopteryx. Have you ever heard of this? The
On it?
Archaeopteryx.
Oh, absolutely. The Archaeopteryx is fascinating.
It's like this ancient creature. It's like this mosaic. It's like a blend of both bird and reptile traits. So it's got feathers like a bird, but it also has teeth and a bony tail like a reptile. And it's such a powerful, at least to me, it's such a powerful piece of evidence for how one species can gradually transition into another. It's like it blurs the lines that we often take for granted.
It's a beautiful example of what we call a transitional fossil, that like missing link that demonstrates the interconnectedness of species. And Dawkins argues, and rightfully so, that these fossils, which often exhibit this fascinating blend of characteristics, really beautifully illustrate the concept of descent with modification. This is a core principle of evolution, this idea of descent with modification.
Yeah, and it's like nature is constantly experimenting, trying out new combinations, and sometimes those combinations stick around and they get passed down and sometimes they don't. It's fascinating. And he also talks about the bacterial flagellum. It's this tiny, intricate structure. Basically, some bacteria use it to move around, but it's so complex that some people argue, look, that this couldn't have evolved gradually. They're like, this had to be designed. It had to be designed all at once.
Right, the irreducible complexity argument. That's a very common challenge to evolution. But Dawkins, along with many other prominent biologists, convincingly dismantles this idea. And they explain that, look, structures like the flagellum likely evolved from simpler components that originally served different functions. So over time, these components were co-opted, they were modified, and eventually they gave rise to these more complex structures we see today.
So it's not like there was this grand plan from the beginning. It's like evolution doesn't have a blueprint. It's just responding to the environment, right?
Yeah.
It's all about these small changes accumulating over generations, kind of being shaped and molded by this engine of natural selection.
Precisely. And what's amazing is that these adaptations, they might seem perfectly designed for their current purpose. And it's easy to look at them and think, wow, that must have been the intention all along. But that's not how evolution works, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have foresight. It doesn't plan ahead. It's a completely blind process.
But the results are amazing. And it's funny because Dawkins talks about how even scientists, like with all their knowledge and their understanding of evolution, can still experience this sense of almost like childlike awe when they really contemplate the mysteries of it all.
I think there's something really beautiful about that. It reminds us that no matter how much we learn, there will always be more to discover. And that sense of wonder, that drive to understand, that's really at the heart of scientific inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of wonder, I think it's worth taking a moment to really consider the vastness of the universe. I mean, the universe plays a crucial role in Dawkins' thinking, especially when he's discussing the origins of life.
Absolutely. When you really grasp the sheer scale of the cosmos, with its billions of galaxies and countless stars and planets, it completely changes the equation when we talk about the probability of life.
Right. It's like winning the lottery.
In a way, yes. The odds of life arising on any one particular planet might be astronomically small. But when you factor in the immensity of the universe, when you consider just how many planets are out there, it becomes almost statistically inevitable that life would emerge somewhere. We just happen to find ourselves on one of those incredibly fortunate planets where the conditions were just right.
It really does put things in perspective, doesn't it? It makes you feel kind of small, but also like in a good way, And this brings us to something known as the anthropic principle, this idea that we observe the universe to be fine-tuned for life simply because if it weren't, we wouldn't be here to observe it in the first place.
Exactly. It's a bit of a mind bender, but it makes sense when you really think about it. If the fundamental constants of physics were even slightly different, if the laws of nature were just a tiny bit off, life as we know it couldn't exist.
So we're incredibly lucky to be here. And on this fluke of a planet, this planet teeming with life, with all its beauty and its cruelty, its complexities, this is where Dawkins really wants to dive into the roots of some very human traits, like altruism. And of course, something that's kind of a big theme for him, religion. And this is where the selfish gene really takes center stage. So we've gone through Dawkins' arguments against the God hypothesis. We've talked about evolution as this, blind watchmaker. But it still leaves us with a pretty big question, and I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking the same thing. If there is no God, no divine creator who sets down the rules, where does morality come from? Like, do we really need a God to be good?
That's a question that's been pondered for centuries. And Dawkins offers a thought-provoking perspective. He dives into this idea that evolution doesn't just shape our physical traits, it also shapes our social behaviors. Our morality, our ideas of right and wrong, of good and bad. Dawkins argues they're not like divinely ordained commandments, but products of our evolutionary history.
So instead of receiving those moral guidelines from a higher power, we're essentially hardwired with them. That's a pretty radical idea when you think about it.
It might seem radical at first, but when you break it down, it starts to make sense. Cooperation, empathy, a sense of fairness, these are all traits that would have been beneficial for our ancestors living in social groups, right?
Yeah, I can see that.
Those who possess these traits would be more likely to revive, reproduce, pass those traits on to their offspring. So over countless generations, these behaviors, these inclinations toward what we now call good became ingrained into our very being, woven into the fabric of who we are.
So being good, or at least what was considered good in an evolutionary sense, gave our ancestors a leg up, so to speak. Huh. Makes you wonder how much those ancient survival instincts are still influencing our moral compasses today.
It's a question worth pondering for sure. It's an ongoing area of research. But I think it's worth bringing in Dawkins' take on one of the most influential texts on morality that exists, the Bible.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from tackling that one. He's got some pretty strong opinions about it, too.
He does. He doesn't see the Bible as this, perfect and infallible source of morality that some people might. He points out that it's full of contradictions and inconsistencies and, honestly, even instances of what most people today would consider morally reprehensible behavior. And he challenges us to reconcile these issues with this idea of it being this, divine moral code.
Well, it's definitely a good reminder that, context matters. What might have been considered morally acceptable thousands of years ago doesn't necessarily hold up in the modern world. Our understanding of morality evolves.
Exactly. And that ties into the idea that morality itself isn't this static or absolute thing, right? It's fluid, it changes over time, it's influenced by cultural shifts, by societal norms, even by scientific advancements. But let's loop this back to Dawkins' concept of the selfish gene, which I know can sound a little jarring at first.
Right. It's not about being selfish in a greedy way or anything like that, is it?
No, not at all. It's a way of understanding how genes, those tiny blueprints of life, essentially strive for their own replication. That's their primary goal, to make more copies of themselves.
Survival of the fittest, kind of?
In a way, yes. And what's fascinating is that this drive to replicate, this kind of genetic self-interest, it can actually explain a lot of behaviors that we might initially see as selfless, like altruism.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, think about it. Dawkins argues that even acts of selflessness can often be traced back to this underlying genetic imperative.
Oh.
For example, we're much more likely to behave altruistically towards those we share genes with, our relatives.
That makes sense, yeah. Like that old saying, blood is thicker than water.
Exactly. And there's a biological basis for that. It's called kin selection. From a gene's perspective, helping a relative to survive, to reproduce, it increases the chances that some of your shared genes are going to get passed down to future generations. So even in acts of apparent selflessness, there's this underlying element of genetic self-preservation at play.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. So it's like our genes are pulling the strings behind the scenes, so to speak?
You could say that.
Yeah.
But what's even more intriguing is how Dawkins takes this idea of replicators, things that make copies of themselves, and applies it not just to genes, but also to the realm of culture, specifically to the spread of ideas. And that's where memes come in.
Oh, memes. Everyone loves a good meme.
Right. And Dawkins was talking about memes long before they were, cat pictures with funny captions on the internet. He used the term to describe any cultural unit of information that spreads from person to person. So it could be a catchy song, a religious belief, a fashion trend, even a scientific theory.
So those ideas that are really good at replicating themselves, they're the ones that are going to stick around, right? Kind of like survival of the fittest, but for ideas.
Exactly. Memes that are catchy, that are memorable, that evoke a strong emotional response, they're going to spread like wildfire. While those that aren't as effective at replicating, they're going to fade away. And this leads to his, I think, pretty thought-provoking take on religion.
This should be
right. He sees religion as a very powerful memeplex. That's his term for it, a memeplex. And it's basically this complex of interconnected memes that all kind of reinforce and perpetuate each other. And you have to admit, from a purely mimetic perspective, religion has been incredibly successful at replicating itself throughout human history.
It's everywhere.
Exactly. Think about it. The promise of eternal life, the fear of eternal damnation, the rituals and traditions that bind people together into communities. These are all very powerful concepts, concepts that resonate deeply with us on an emotional level, making us more likely to accept those beliefs and to transmit them to others.
It's almost like, from this meme perspective, it doesn't even really matter if the beliefs themselves are objectively true. What matters is how effective they are at spreading from one mind to another.
That's the crux of it, yeah. It's a whole new way of thinking about why certain ideas, even if they might seem irrational when you really analyze them, have had such a powerful grip on humanity for so long.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about. So Dawkins he's given us this window into the power of evolution, not just to shape our physical bodies, but also our very minds, our beliefs, our behaviors. And he's challenged us to think critically about, well, everything, really, the nature of belief, the origins of morality.
And ultimately what it means to be human in a world where there might not be some kind of divine plan or purpose.
It's a lot to unpack. So for everyone listening, I hope this deep dive has sparked some curiosity. We encourage you to check out Richard Dawkins' work for yourselves if you haven't already. And as always, keep those questions coming, keep those conversations going, because the more we explore these big ideas, the closer we get to understanding who we are and what it all means. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.